This is the first in our new series called Palette Building. Today we'll be talking about solids and prints. Stick around. Hi, I'm Weeks Ringel from Modern Quilt Studio. If you're new to our channel, I hope you'll hit that red subscribe button and join us for all of our tutorials on YouTube. Today we'll go through the basics of color theory as it pertains to quilting and give you a lot of examples about how to choose a solid that will do what you want it to do for your quilt when you have a palette of prints. But let's get started with just the basics that you need to, a refresher on color as it pertains to fabric. So as you can see, I've got our color wheel here, and we'll just be using 3 words today that you'll need to remember. The first is hue, and that in this particular color wheel are the spokes of the color wheel. It's that section of the color spectrum that you see, and it's the difference between blue and green, for example, and typically the word that most people describe for color. But hue is the way we're going to talk about it because we're going to break down color into 3 different segments. The second term that's worth remembering is value, and that's the lightness or darkness of the hue. In this particular color wheel, you'll see that the darker values are on the outside of the color wheel and the lighter values are on the inside of the color wheel. The last word you need to know is saturation, and that is the intensity of the color, and the color in its purest form. So for example, you can see these are 2 of our solids bundles. This is the summer bundle and the spring bundle. And you can see, although they're similar in hue, this one is a little bit more saturated than this one. So it's that intensity or that vibrancy of the color. And that is a really important concept to understand, especially when you're talking about neutrals and solids that you're going to use with the prints that you have in your palette. So in preparation for this series, we asked on social media what questions you have for using solids and prints and figuring out the best neutral for your palette. So I'll be reading some of those questions as we go and showing you some palettes that we've put together that we hope will help you answer those questions. The first is, how do you make sure the solids don't look too flat or plain compared to the patterns? Is there a proportion of solids to prints that you should aim for? So I've gotten some of our vintage fabrics as a good example of how to illustrate this point. So if you think about, go back to the color wheel and you look at this palette, you'll be able to see that there are different hues, right, all the way around the color wheel. And there are different values. There are some lighter fabrics in this palette and there's some darker ones as well. However, they're similar in saturation, which is that there's a jewel tone quality to all of them that makes them look rich. And many people would usually, well, I guess the traditional way to think about pairing a solid would be that many people would look for, they would pull a color from this palette and they would use that for the solid in their quilt. And let's say it was the pattern that we use here in our Woodlands quilt. So we're talking about, what is this taupe fabric here? That's kind of the background color. Field color is another way that people referred to it. So we're thinking about different options. And if you look at the this pale taupe that we used in the Woodlands quilt, you'll see that by having a more desaturated neutral in the background, that it makes the colors in the prints become more vivid and look more saturated and richer. In contrast, if we had put a bright fabric, a bright solid with those prints, it would make them look more dull and washed out. So, for example, if we took one of these, you can see that by putting a saturated color with these fabrics, they look more dull, and that's not showing the fabric to its best advantage. So you're looking for contrast in the background fabric. So you can go more desaturated or lighter or darker. There's a lot of different options. So I'm going to show you a few. So here's the palette of all of our vintage fabrics. And I've chosen this, it's kind of like a khaki olive color, which is not really in the, there's no example of this exact hue, but what it is a more desaturated version of one of the colors, like these greens down here. So by using a duller color, a more desaturated color, the rest of the palette starts to look brighter and more cheerful. Another option would be to go with a darker and more desaturated palette. So let's see, this is the charcoal. And let me just show you what this looks like if we were to move this palette over here. So it's not going to be as stark as a black, but you'll be able to see the richness of the colors more because you're not using a super bright palette. So when the person who asked the question about the proportion of solids to prints, we're assuming that we're just talking about one solid and the rest of the palette is prints in this particular case. But the idea of it looking too flat is that you don't want it to compete with the prints. So it's unlikely to look too flat unless it looks too stark. And an example of it looking too stark would be if you put a bright white with this, or if you put a black with it, for example, it might look too stark and too flat. So you're looking for contrast, but you don't want an enormous amount of contrast. You want just enough that the colors look bright and rich, and that the palette looks, that the prints are showing off and they're not competing with that background fabric. So let's look at another example where you're just using a single print. So if you look here in our split decision pattern, you'll see that this pattern uses only one print and one solid. So you really want to get that right. And what many people would do would be, let's say we're going to use our Frolic Lemon print here for the split decision pattern. Many people would pull the navy fabric that's in here and they would pair it and it would match, and they would check that off as being a good option. To me, the contrast between both the value, this is much darker, as well as the hue, makes this very stark. And if you look by comparison, we have a cypress solid that looks a little bit softer. So let me see if I can show you all of these at one time. It's a little awkward, but I think you'll be able to see it if I can get these right. I think the cypress here is a little bit softer and is a little bit less stark. So a lot of times when you're choosing your solids, you're going to be figuring out what is the look of the quilt you're going for. Do you want it to be a huge graphic contrast, or do you want it to be a little bit softer? And I'm sure you can see that the navy matches and it works in terms of the colorway, but because there's such a big jump in both hue and in value, it's going to seem kind of stark. But let's look at that cypress again. This is a little bit less saturated, but it isn't quite as big a jump in terms of value. So even though the hue is different and the saturation is different, it's less of a leap. So you have plenty of contrast, but it's not quite as stark as the navy. Let's look at another palette that addresses the question of how do I choose a solid background that doesn't look flat? But the other option is you don't want it to look too matchy-matchy either, or else the fabrics themselves will look washed out, or it'll be just kind of hard to get that contrast you need. So let's look at this palette, which would be a scrappy green palette. Now, I think this, what a lot of people would do would be to look for, they would try to match this bright green in this palette. But you can see that then you start to have the competition of the saturation of this fabric with the prints. So let's look at another option. And going darker, and again, more desaturated, gives you a different degree of kind of crispness and freshness. As you can see, this palette looks a little bit more vibrant when it's against a darker, more desaturated background than it does when it's next to this bright background. Now, the question we had was, how do you prevent it from looking flat? Now, a lot of people look at gray, and gray is a very popular background, but you can see that this palette, if you put this palette on the gray, it would look much more washed out and a little bit flatter. So gray isn't always the option. Gray isn't always the best choice. But having something that's in that same color family, in that, that same hue, but a darker value and more desaturated, is often a really good choice. Now let me look at one other option that you might consider, which would be to go with a similar hue, but go much lighter. So you can see how this would look. That would also be an option. So you could go darker or you could go lighter. But if you try to use that same value, you're going to get competition with the prints themselves. Another question we received is, how do you choose good quality solids? And how do you choose fabrics and colors that aren't going to date quickly? And the easy answer to the question of quality is that we're using the Benartex Superior Solids. And Benartex has made this swatch card easy, so you can shop at home or ask your local quilt shop if they have specific colors. But what we like about these swatch cards is the individual swatches are only glued at the top. So you can lift up a swatch and put it on top of your fabric to see whether you're going to get the contrast you need. We sell these swatch cards on our website, and you can also ask your local quilt shop whether they sell them. But this is a really great way for you to be able to audition fabrics at home, whether or not you're buying locally or whether or not you need to buy online. But having a swatch card is a really great way to be able to audition fabrics successfully and know what you're going to get when it arrives in the mail if you're buying or you're ordering even through your local quilt shop, to make sure you're ordering the fabric that's really going to work. But the question of how do you choose background colors to make sure you're not going to have the colors look dated is an easy one, because great color work is never dated. So if you are choosing a great palette, it will never look dated, because fabrics, you look at colors, palettes that from the 1960s or the 1950s or the 1930s, and they still look great. The good design is good design, and it's really timeless. But I'll give you an example here with our yarn dyes. These are our warp and weft premium yarn dyes that we designed for Benartex. And one of the ways that people look at a palette like this and try to think about the color is to think about a neutral, and they'll think about a black or a white or whatever. But another tremendously useful but surprising neutral that we've discovered is this dark teal. And this dark teal brings out the vibrancy of these yarn dyes, even though this teal is not a color found in this bundle. But again, it goes to a darker value than the fabrics that are in the bundle, and it's a little bit more desaturated. So this aqua on top looks that much more vibrant, as do the oranges and greens and blues and purples and grays. So having some kind of slightly darker, slightly more desaturated hue than the colors that are in, say, a multicolored bundle is another way to think about a useful neutral solid for your background. Another question we received was, can the right neutral marry together some prints you would normally never pair together? And the answer to that is yes. So we grabbed a bundle of slightly more traditional fabrics in traditional colors, and that you wouldn't necessarily pair together. However, the right neutral paired with it really pulls this bundle together. So this is actually an espresso brown, and again, there's no espresso brown in either of these, in any of these fabrics, but if you look at them together, the espresso makes them look really rich and very crisp in terms of the edges and being able to see each fabric individually. So again, it's not a color that you would normally go to or that has been popular in the past, but we found that the espresso brown is a very, it's a unifying color that is much less harsh than black and is a little unexpected. Another one is eggplant, or sometimes like a dark plum. This is the eggplant from the Superior Solids. And you can see that that's an unexpected neutral, but it's dark enough that it provides contrast and makes all of these fabrics that are similar in saturation, and similar somewhat in value, but different in hue. It looks a lot more unified with this background that's so much darker, but is equally as rich as the rest of the fabrics. We also got a question about which colors in a palette should dictate the solids that you're going to use with the rest of the palette. Now, many people would look at this palette, which is made up from a variety of lines and scrappy, and they would say that all of them have white in it, so you should use white. However, the fabrics are going to read very awkwardly. For example, especially this fabric in particular, when it's on a white background, because you're going to get that, it's a figure ground problem where the seam is going to be hard to read in these large expanses of white. So I would say that if you have white in a fabric, or you have a color that's found in all of the fabrics, I would actually avoid that color, or go to a darker value or a lighter value or more desaturated version of that, that color, because you're not going to be able to get that nice crisp edge on the when the patchwork is in place. So rather than a white, which would be many people's default, I would think about this marine blue. And if you look at how nice this is with this palette, again, it doesn't have to be gray, it doesn't have to be black, it doesn't have to be white. You can go with a darker version of a hue that's already in the palette. So this darker marine blue is similar in hue, but it's a much darker version. It's not desaturated, it's not a straight up neutral, but for this particular palette, it works really well. And there's another one I've chosen that works well with this palette, which is this lipstick red. And this could also work. However, I would probably remove this fabric because it's a little bit too close to it. So sometimes you might need to edit if you want a particular background color. But the whole idea is that the idea of neutrals doesn't necessarily mean it just has to be gray or taupe or tan. It can just be a fabric that's happy to be in the background to allow your prints to show their best advantage. Thanks for joining us for our first video on palette building. We're looking forward to making more of these videos and hope that you'll find them useful. Please let us know in the comments below whether this has been helpful to you and what other questions you have that we can answer in our series as we move forward. Take care.